Well, as I said, everybody's been very polite all day. I'm hoping to, if not get full Ron Casey-style Normie Rowe fisticuffs going. This is a tough town, Western Sydney, so let's get down to some serious stuff. Premier's left the building. We can get a little loose now. Premier's still here. We can't get so loose.
Might have been a bit more interesting if you left for 5 minutes, boss.
She's a girl from the tough streets of Willoughby. We'll be fine too. She can mix it up. We've assembled 5 people on the panel who have one thing in common. They're all very strong of view, and that's what we'd like to see. We also polled all of the attendees before today to offer them to ask a question or to allow me to ask a question. Guess what? Most of you allowed me to ask the tough questions. Thanks very much. Thanks for your ideas. Thanks for not offering to put your hands up. There are a few, however, who did. So as I see those hands go up, I'm going to throw straight to you. It's Friday afternoon. We're not going to go on forever. We're going to try and get through as many questions. If you promise to be quick from the floor, I promise to make sure these guys be quick from the stage, and they get a little controversial. In doing so, I encourage you all, when you see put a hand up, we'll get a microphone to you. But I thought I'd kick off and get it started. And let's start. We're always fun. Start to the right with Andrew Clennell, the face, the voice, the being of the press gallery of the Daily Telegraph. Mate, let's put aside the great championing of the Commonwealth Games today. Let's go to other issues. You guys cop a bad rap sometimes over a region. You're both a defender of the West and often accused by others as not always having its best interests at heart. From a Telegraph perspective, the great social, cultural experiment that is Western Sydney, are we getting it right, or are we forgetting the fact that there's a seething mass of discontentment that is likely to explode at any moment?
Well, what are you giving me Mark Latham's role with that, eh? Or
Mark,
you want to give me a bit of Latham action? When do we ever do the wrong thing by the West? Where for the West? You could not find an organisation that is a bigger advocate for the West, apart from you, Chris, than us. So I'd dispute that. First of all, I think things are going great. I think this government's got to claim a lot of credit for it, to be honest, and because they sold the electricity so they could actually build things. Then, luckily there's electoral pressure on them in terms of seats, including Stuart's, that they have to keep doing so. And you'd hope if there was a Labor government come into power, you'd have the same situation. They'd have to keep looking after the West. But it's the transport, it's the WestConnex, it's the schools, it's the hospitals, but it's the Badgerys Creek. It's really a once in a generation boost to the joint. I just have 2 issues, which I was going to mention to the Minister. Mate, why are you trying to get a stadium in Moore Park instead of ANZ? Why were you a booster for that? I mean, are you the Minister for Western Sydney or not, first of all? And second of all, you guys promised the whole powerhouse was going to come here. Why isn't the whole powerhouse coming here?
Stuart.
Well, Andrew, I'm not sure whether you already knew this, but a lot of the powerhouse was already in Western Sydney. It was at Castle Hill, where we have a facility that's already out there. It runs fantastic opportunities for public exhibition through Castle Hill. It's also a storage facility where many of the exhibits that can't be on exhibition function from as well. So I actually think the opportunity to have a flagship museum of applied arts and sciences based here in Parramatta, unashamedly the key focal point for that institution, doesn't mean that we should take away opportunities for the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences and, quite frankly, any other of our national institutions that might be housed in traditional CBD locations to run exhibitions across other parts of Western Sydney. I think this is a game changer when it comes to cultural policy in New South Wales. It's unashamedly focused on Western Sydney, and it also gives us the flexibility to continue to push out into locations like Castle Hill, like Penrith, like Blacktown, like Liverpool and Campbelltown. All
right, well, hang on, what about Moore Park? What about how hard you push that thing? What the hell's that got to do with Western Sydney?
Well, I think for me, it's about making sure from a sporting perspective that we've got the right network of stadiums. If you have a look at the 6 assets that we've identified as being important and the focus for our investment strategy, we've got stadiums located at Sydney Olympic Park, stadium located at Parramatta. We've also identified a future outer Western Sydney stadium. That's about making sure that we've got the right network. It's also important that we've got stadiums that are located at Moore Park, the Sydney Cricket Ground and the Sydney Football Stadium, meeting the needs of all of those franchises and clubs that we have here in Sydney. When it comes to cricket, to use that as an example, I think every resident of New South Wales feels like they own the Sydney Cricket Ground, whether they live in Penrith, Blacktown, Dubbo, Coffs Harbour, Wagga Wagga. That's something that's owned by everyone. It just happens to be geographically located at Moore Park. But it's not an eastern suburbs facility by any stretch of the imagination.
Let me toss one to Michelle Rowland, the Shadow Minister for Communications, the member for Greenway around Blacktown, because I don't want Stuart to get the only whack for the day. Michelle, you've been pretty good on your view towards Badgerys Creek. Not all of your colleagues in the Labor Party in Western Sydney have done so. How's Labor going to manage a collective approach to Badgerys going towards the next federal election?
Well, for a start, the support of Badgerys Creek Airport is part of our policy. It's part of our party's policy. And I've taken a two-pronged approach to this. Firstly, we find ourselves in a position today where, let's face it, the government's made a decision about Badgerys. It made a decision some time ago. So my view has been, well, since a decision's been made, how do we best make that work? So my focus has been on, of course, you have to listen to, there are a large number of residents who are opposed to it for various reasons, and they deserve a fair hearing. But the other question is, how do we maximise the job opportunities, not just in the construction phase, but also in the ongoing operational phase? So they are challenges, they are challenges, but they're not ones that I think are insurmountable, and they're certainly ones that can be overcome. The second is, when you look at big job stimulators, it is a reality. There are very few things that can come in with a big bang. And the airport, I'm really hoping, will be one of them. Because when we talk about, we hear the mantra from the federal government about jobs and growth. If you want jobs and growth, you actually have to the government has a role in facilitating those jobs. Businesses create the jobs, but government has a role in facilitating them. So I think you're not wrong, Chris, that it will be a big challenge, but I think everyone on our side is focused.
Curfew is where there really is a division, is there, between... Luke Foley's tried a lot of times to say, I reckon Luke's okay with no curfew, but he's copying an awful lot. He says 1,000 words, it's hard to nail it. Federal Labor, I've heard your leader say, we'll block it now, but we'll let it off later. Is Labor going to get a definitive single position on curfew for Badgerys Creek? I
think we have to, and I think we will. It will, I think, in part depend upon the outcomes of whether the right of first refusal is going to be exercised and what sort of funding mechanism there will be, because the government will have a bigger say in that as opposed to a private operator. But look, you can understand the argument though, which is why is it that there is one rule for the East and one rule for the West? And again, that answer comes down to the flight configurations. It comes down to what will be the lived experience of people. But I think these things, they are definitely things that need to be overcome, and I don't think federal Labor can shy away from that. I'm being very honest with that.
Andy?
Chris, can I just pick up on one thing Michelle said, and I think it's important. It reminded us of the meta-narrative of jobs and growth. And I think on the other side, last July you looked at Labor come out with the Mediscare campaign. I mean, both of them, to some degree, I think contributed to the leaking of votes away from the majors on the airport and a number of issues, simply because they're not specific and they don't speak to the concerns of people in Western Sydney. And I think we're going to start to see that drift away further, and I'm sure Stuart and Michelle have something to say about that. But with issues like the airport, people will cop a call from either side about the curfew, about the jobs figures, about flight paths, but they want a definitive position. And I think that people are prepared to live with that and jump up and down and scream and carry on in Yahoo, but they want governments to have definitive positions and they want them to get away from those meta-narratives that are nebulous and without shape, form or meaning, and get back to stuff that matters to them in their day-to-day lives.
Stuart, can I one to you on that? You fought a pretty good fight in Penrith against some internal opposition as well on the airport. You've got to face the voters in 2 years' time in what's going to be a tough election, obviously, based on the numbers, the polling that's currently there. Are you going to be able to hold the line, or are you fearful that the hordes of NIMBYs from the Blue Mountains are going to pour down the hill and try and put the airport around your neck as a millstone?
Well, Chris, I've nailed my colours to the mast on this one a long time ago. I'm a pro-airport person, have been pretty much from day dot. I don't support a curfew. I haven't since this debate started. It simply makes no sense to lock Western Sydney out to a third of the world for every 24-hour period that the planet circles the sun. Why you would do that, I've got no idea. You can manage flight paths. I don't subscribe to one rule for the east and one rule for the west. The simple fact of the matter is the population density that exists around the existing Sydney airport is significantly different to the population density that is where we're building Badgerys Creek. I think this is a really good example about why the New South Wales Government's Greater Sydney Commission, taking a strategic approach to planning across regions, across councils, gives us a chance to make sure that where we have the highest noise areas that are impacted by that airport, we can use different land use, things like industrial and commercial usage, and then we can put population growth closer to transport corridors. That's all manageable. I think both sides of the federal political divide have agreed to having things like head-to-head operations between hours of 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. So I think the idea of a curfew really should be dead and buried. The airport just simply won't work if it's got one.
Ellie Antonius, there's a question from, is Ellie there? Yeah, Ellie, there's a question from the floor.
Okay. So my question to the panel is, as a current final year social work student who has a disability, there has been a clear focus on providing employment opportunities for people with disabilities in Western Sydney. But in my experience, finding work has been a challenge due to difficulties in physically accessing workplaces, but more significantly, the negative stigma that is associated with having a disability. For this reason, I feel it is important to educate employers and community members in Western Sydney about embracing people with disabilities. So my question to the panel is, how do you intend to raise awareness of and educate Western Sydney community members on the capabilities of people with disabilities, not just their limitations?
Thanks. Nellie's a member of the Academy here at WSU. Who wants to kick off on that one?
Yeah, I'll have a crack at that. Look, great question. I think that we as a country have got a long way to go with continuing to educate people about the profound opportunities that exist by being closely associated with a person with a disability and the way it can change both your workplace, education facility, and provide experiences that not everyone has often had a chance to see. It's about, in my mind, making inclusivity the normal rather than having to be it as a policy position. Just making access to what a lot of able-bodied people considered take for granted is something that we as a government are very focused on. We run a program called Ability Links, for instance. I actually was out in Penrith earlier this morning making a bit of an announcement about this with our Disability Services Minister. That Ability Links program takes volunteers from all different walks of life and we create effectively linkers, and that's quite a sort of colloquial phrase, but they're individuals, they volunteer their time and they allow people to access everything from 120 hours, so if you're a person with a disability you can get your driver's licence. We take them to swimming classes, we allow them to get involved in volunteer programs, sports coaching. So we're doing that, and that is all about breaking down the stigma that's attached to that. The other thing I would also say is the government is a strong supporter, along with the Commonwealth Government, I think this is agreed on both sides of politics, around supporting workplace engagement opportunities. I can think of one business like Nova Employment in my electorate that operates across Western Sydney. For 20 years, they've been putting people into employment. I see businesses right across Western Sydney taking full advantage of that. And the big message I would say to this audience is that I've not found a business that hasn't brought on someone through one of their programs who doesn't think that the rest of their business, as in the rest of their workforce, doesn't benefit from that experience. So it's not just about the individual, but your whole organisation benefits from having that diversity in the workforce.
I would quickly add to that I think we need to tell the stories a little more. Certainly Nova and other agencies like that have countless case studies that just illustrate what's possible, if you do make that leap. The other really quick point I would add is if you think that infrastructure and transport problems are bedeviling for an able-bodied person throughout Western Sydney, then it's compounded for somebody that has those challenges. So I think it's only increases the urgency around those issues as well.
Thanks, Ellie. Hopefully Ellie's inspired some other people to put their hand up too. So I'm not going to let you off scot-free. There's a question came in from you. Amna, do you really think that Western Sydney can sustainably and equitably grow into a global city without first addressing the entrenched racism that seems to never leave the Australian public? You get the token racism question, apparently, so there you go. Used to be the Irish getting it, by the way, so, you know, there's waves of it.
Oh, but I think there's a layer of complexity that the Irish didn't have, and I think that it's not just racism. We're talking about discrimination on all levels. We're talking about bigotry, gender bias, unconscious bias, and it speaks to the point you just made about disability. It's incredibly frustrating. It's incredibly disempowering when your narrative is defined. And if we're to give you a good example, we're having a conversation about what it is to be from Western Sydney and whether being a Westie is an offensive term or a positive thing, and what spin do you want to put on it. So imagine the layers that young people now have to grow up with, compounded by social media. It's incredibly frustrating, and it's difficult to create a sense of hope when what they see is failure. And they don't see pathways, and they don't see opportunities, they don't see institutions like this and think, I can aspire to go to university and I can get a good job with the Daily Telegraph, for example, or be a politician, because they just don't see as people valuing them in society. Now, that is a lived reality of people that I'm related to, that I play football with, and, you know, sport is fantastic. I love that I get to, every single day, get up and do something that I love and create hope for a small group of people that I play football with, but it's simply not enough. So when it comes to structural discrimination, there needs to be some serious change. And while we have this conversation, and I have the privilege of being in this room and listen to this incredible conversation, there are people who don't give a shit. Like, there are people who don't even understand what you're talking about. My football team are like, why are you interested in all that stuff? What does it actually mean? They don't even vote. I have to argue about the importance of voting with them. I have to argue with them why they should pursue higher learning. So, you know, this is the level of disadvantage people in my life have. So what do we do with that?
I'll tell you what, you got a much better chance of getting a job on the Daily Telegraph as a Westie than you do on the Sydney Morning Herald. But look, and I can actually speak with authority because I've worked for both. First 8 or 9 years of my life were in southwestern Sydney, Georges Hall, and then Western Australia. Look, it is harder for Westies. It is harder for Westies, but that doesn't mean that you can't make it in this country. That's the great thing about this country. And, you know, it is easier if you went to the right posh school and you were from the North Shore. It is. But that is why, in most fields, including business, journalism, politics, everywhere else, the Westies are the toughest, and they're often the best. And so that's what I would say that you should be saying to people who are a bit despondent about how they're viewed in Western Sydney.
I think it extends far beyond living in Western Sydney. We're talking about what does it mean for my 13-year-old brother, whose name is Mohammed, who goes to Granville Boys, who has layers and layers and layers of stereotypes and levels of discrimination that maybe another Anglo-Australian boy from Western Sydney has those stereotypes too, but it's not all those layers of discrimination. So he's not just discriminated on the fact that he's born and raised in Western Sydney. No, there are other things that compound that discrimination.
Sure, but I just think, you know, I don't deny that, or I don't seek to diminish that, but I think, you know, in this city and this country, you've got a better chance than in a lot of other places in the world. You know, you can get past all that, you can fight your way past all that, and it makes you a stronger person out of it. You know? Cameron
Klein came out of Penrith to run the NAB, jeez. He ended up with the AAU, so he's reversed towards the North Shore, but Chris, Another same school, weren't you? You and Cameron?
Yeah, we did go to the same school. Look, Chris, I reckon the world falls largely into two categories when it comes to this. There's leaders and there's followers. And I think the more people are prepared to accept that they're actually leaders in their communities, people like
this
you
lady.
know, the footballer that's sitting right next to me. We're actually members of the same football club. I'm a life member of the Penrith Rams, and the Penrith Rams women's team merged with the Auburn Giants, and the Penrith Auburn Giants now play in the Sydney AFL competition.
We do go Western Sydney.
And I reckon that's a fantastic story. But it requires people who know where they need to take communities, whether you're a politician, a footballer, an academic, a journalist. It doesn't really matter what you are. When you've got an opportunity to lead people in a better direction, you need to take that. Now, not everyone is blessed with that capacity, or not everyone is prepared to accept the burden of leadership, but those that know they've got it, they've got to look straight in the eye of another person and explain to them why what they're doing is wrong and change their behaviour.
Well, it's one of the three Earl supporters on the panel, Andy and Michelle, joining me. Michelle, you represent a large part of Blacktown in your community. If we're talking disadvantage, I think Westie's a bad term. Throw Houso in as well. A large bank of public housing that still exists around Blacktown. Do you feel all politicians, have we moved it forward? Is the disadvantage diminishing, or is it getting even higher? Is the gap shrinking or widening for the kids who are coming up through intergenerational welfare in public housing estates?
I think there's two answers to that. First is, there are a lot of people who lived in Western Sydney for a long time, such as myself. I grew up in Blacktown. My husband grew up in a public housing estate of Mount Druitt. And Andrew mentioned the ability to be role models and set yourself up. Well, my husband couldn't speak English when he started school. Now he's a partner in a national law firm, leading a practice. So
Premier couldn't speak English either, and she's the Premier now.
You can do anything. So I think there's one side where I think there are a lot of people who have recognised, and other people have recognised they have talent and have helped them along, and there's been a real focus, particularly in the schools around some of those areas of high disadvantage like Layla Park and Blacktown, that are really making a big difference. And we all, when we talk about leadership, sure, politicians are leaders in a certain way, but also we have to be leaders outside of the political spectrum as well. You have to. I think it's important to take the time, and I'm sure Stuart does it as well. You take the time when you see someone who's got talent. You make time for them.
You represent the Labor Party, which has traditionally been the political advocate for that part of the community. My old man was one of those, 20 years ago out of Parramatta as well. Can Labor put its hand up and say that the people of Western Sydney have benefited from that time of Labor, or is there a recommitment? Have they been left behind a little by the inner city push for Labor? Have they forgotten the Western Sydney public housing core base that was most Labor politicians have always gone into Parliament to serve?
Look, if you forget them, you may as well go home if you're a Labor member, and if you're a member of any political party for that matter, because they are the ones who would turn on you the worst. It's no secret that in 2010, when I came into the seat, we had some pretty bad swings. I can tell you where the worst ones were. They were in Labor areas. But I can tell you in the last election and the one before it, where some of the best swings happened, and they were in the aspirational areas. And that goes to the second point I wanted to make earlier. There are a lot of people who go. Mark Latham, we mentioned him earlier. Mark Latham described them as aspirationals. They are starting to feel like the forgotten people now. They are the people who, they have big mortgages, they're on relatively good incomes. But you know what? They don't rely on government that much. And where government is supposed to play a role and lets them down, that is where they feel it the worst. And I'll give you an example of that. I have some of the newest housing areas in suburbs like the Ponds and Stanhope Gardens. They're variously described as some of the most advantaged, but also some of the most disadvantaged in all of Sydney. And the biggest gripe that I will get from people is, why isn't there enough commuter car parking at my local train station? I have to park half an hour away, which adds a half an hour to my day, which means I miss my train, which means I miss picking up my kids from childcare at the end of the day. They are all issues that go to quality of life. And they are starting to feel like the forgotten people. Now, some of you may scoff and say, it must be pretty tough living in a big house and having a couple of four-wheel drives. But this is the way society has changed in that part of the world. That is how people are now viewing themselves.
Andrew, you'll be commenting on a state and federal election over the next 18 months to 2 years, where Western Sydney is expected to dominate again, even though in New South Wales, the bloody regional New South Wales, the Bush is apparently coming up as our new, and we had to share the stage a little, but let's assume we're still at the centre of that. Are you picking at the moment what you think based on recent elections? Should the government, who hold both, should they be very nervous? Is Labor in trouble? What's your read 2 years out?
You should be nervous about Western Sydney at every election, and that's some of its political power, really, the power of the people who live here. If Stuart loses his seat, the coalition loses government. He's got a 6% margin, I reckon. If he's losing that, if Tanya Davies is losing Mulgoa, they will cop a hit in the bush. You could see 4 or 5 gnats go in the bush, then you've lost your majority. So really, I imagine every day that Stuart goes to work, he's very cognizant of that fact, and that he knows that the government really rests with him and his fellow Western Sydney MPs.
I think he's making Cabinet pretty cognizant of it as well.
And that's why he's going for the stadium at Moore Park. But no, look, I think that it is just so critical, and really, I think the state government kind of has a little bit of whip hand there, whereas the federal government probably doesn't. The infrastructure could save the state government a bit. Having said that, decisions like the Greyhounds decision, that sort of thing, that resonated poorly in those seats that the state government needed to win. And it's going to be one hell of a fight. The reports you hear from focus groups and that is people often say, well, you're giving me that, what about something else? The voters aren't content these days, even if you build them $10 or $15 billion things. I guess they take a while to bring them on stream too, but cost of living bites big time. We're going to see that again with power prices. It's just going to be fascinating in those areas. And I remember in 2007 state election, I door knocked in Emu Plains with a candidate. Every door was work choices. You just know when you door knock in those areas, and sure enough, Debenham lost the election, then Howard lost the election. You just know when you door knock in those areas, you guys must get an insight before the rest of us about what's going to kill a government or save a government.
We spoke about big data. That's the ultimate big data. Door knock, you get the good data response. Yeah. Andy, you're the political expert for the university. Give us a read on federal politics too.
Yeah, look, just really quickly, and I think, you saw very distinct swings in those outer Western Sydney seats, so, Lindsay, MacArthur and Macquarie.
Not
unexpected.
Greenway.
And it defied the intelligence, on the ground. And a lot of us were saying that it was the little issues, the little things, the things like Michelle talked about, that are going to really sting people, and that's the stuff that's going to swing them. And that's why I think you need to be straight with them. This state government's been pretty good in the sense that they've gotten on and done stuff. So you've seen them out there building things and doing things. So big tick in that area. But I think, and Stuart will be very aware of this, that you need to be addressing the little stuff, the bill shop, the stuff about transport.
Health. You can be doing it all on transport, but if you're not doing it on health on the P and hospital or whatever, you're stuffed.
And Medicare didn't need to have any evidence behind it. Didn't need a scary of evidence. It was just a bloody big bus with a sign on it.
So to that point, Stuart, one of our beautiful questions I meant to ask. Does New South Wales need a minister for Western Sydney? You just got the gig back. Is it just a token portfolio or an acknowledgement the government isn't naturally inclined to give enough attention to the region?
Well, I'm more than happy to have the job. I'll say that out loud.
But I think it's signed Maurice Payne, I think, is the question.
Look, I think one of the reasons why the government does have a focus on Western Sydney is the profound impact that Western Sydney will have on the long-term prosperity of the economics of New South Wales. And that is everyone's business, whether you live on the North Shore, Southern Sydney, the North Coast, the South Coast, or in the bush. If Western Sydney is performing well economically, then we're driving greater economic output right across the state. If you look at the infrastructure and construction agenda that is before Western Sydney over the next 10 years, it is the same for New South Wales as what the mining boom was for Western Australia. In fact, many of the workers that were in mines in Western Australia are now in tunnels and rail projects that we're building. The residential development that will roll out across greenfield developments west of the M7 is also going to be a huge driver of what happens there. If you want to avoid some of the challenges that are spoken about at conferences like this, you've got to make sure those residential developments are connected with good quality transport. You've got to make sure that healthcare and education keeps pace with growth as well, and that's why in somewhere like Western Sydney, this state government's investing $2.5 billion in new hospitals, whether they're Westmead or Blacktown or Campbelltown, and even Nepean in my own electorate. So I think we've got the... and I think of it as a contract. In fact, I know the Greater Sydney Commission uses the word about the development compact, which is if you're going to bring this growth onto the community, then you've got to live up to your other end of the bargain, which is the supply of infrastructure and the opportunity to access services. And that's something that I think we've done really well. Just to kind of draw two of those things together, one of the things I think Western Sydney owns or has discovered but a lot in the last 5 to 10 years, and that its vote is much more tactical now. You know, there used to be a sort of traditional stable voting pattern. Now, I think the stability of the voting pattern still exists. It's a little bit more constrained. Maybe the middle's a bit larger and the base votes of the major parties are a little bit smaller. But what I think Western Sydney has discovered as it's matured economically is that it can deploy its vote in a much more tactical fashion. And that means it's much more susceptible to hyper-local issues. So MPs in Western Sydney now have to balance a macroeconomic environment that includes long lead time infrastructure delivery and strategic planning, as well as making sure that the phasing on the lights in the main road and the station car park gets built and that the air conditioning exists in the school library. And if you don't blend both of those two things together, then you're going to find yourself in trouble.
Perfect. I'll still scan the audience for hands, and I'll keep going until I do. I'll start with Michelle and throw to the panel. Both parties are sitting here heading to an election worried about the rise of Pauline Hanson, our Brexit, our Trumpism in Western Sydney. What do you do in Greenway and Blacktown, as Stuart's facing you, Penrith and other parts? Do you think it's genuine there'll be a Hanson vote? Is that an indication that the punters are sick of the major parties?
I think it was in the 2011 election. I think Pauline Hanson was running in that one, and I think in the upper house. And from memory, she got probably her best vote, at least in metropolitan Sydney, was in the state seat of Blacktown for that election. So it certainly isn't one that can be taken lightly. But look, I think any political party, you need to give voters a reason to vote for you, not just to vote against the other mob. And I think the focus that we have for Labor federally is really focused on good policy formulation. You know, we went into the last election with a really good set, I believe, of policies, a lot of which, you know, that I worked on as well. They were costed, they were arrived at
Are
through...
the locals listening, Michelle? Was good policy going to swing it, or do they just want to burn the joint down?
I don't think they want to burn the... Well, I haven't met the ones who want to burn the joint down yet. I've met the ones who were disappointed, particularly with Malcolm Turnbull. I don't think there's any secret there. You know, I just finished 3 intensive days of mobile officers around the joint. The number of people I had coming up to me saying, I usually vote Liberal, but I'm not going to vote Liberal as long as he's there, you know. And, you know,
Now,
that's
Tony
a
Abbott
few of them.
follows you door to door, does he?
Yeah, but look, that's the sort of sentiment that I'm getting. I'm not getting, you know, you lot, you know, you need to be kicked out. You know, they need to. You need to be kicked out. This government needs to be kicked out, and you all need to be replaced by Pauline Hanson. I'm not getting that yet. And by the way, the best big data, I believe, it's, you know, people used to talk about continuous campaigning. Campaigns are about relationships now, and you don't call them campaigns. It's called being an MP now. You need to establish those relationships with people, which is why it's a hard slog. And people, when they often get into a rapport with you, they let you know what they're thinking without being asked. And I can't say that I'm getting the absolute, you know, Pauline Hanson is going to end up becoming Prime Minister yet. There is disappointment, and there's particularly disillusionment with, you know, the promise of, you know, what you were discussing earlier about the macro level. Like, slogans aren't going to cut it. Slogans aren't going to cut it next time.
I guarantee she's not going to get a photo shoot with the Auburn Penrith Giants anytime soon.
No,
part of her
absolutely
thing.
not.
There's a gentleman out the back with a question.
Chris, just before that gentleman, one observation I would make about the emergence of minor parties is I think it's got... voters in marginal seats will punish stalemate governments. So governments who can't get things done. I actually think that there's a question here for oppositions, both at the state and federal level, and it's easy for me to say this, I'm in government, but if you look back, and I'll use John Howard as an example here, and I don't think we talk nearly enough about this, but one of the things that John Howard talked a lot about was the support that he gave the government in the 80s during the early stages of economic reform. And I look at the way politics is conducted in Australia at the moment, and I see that I think oppositions have recognised that the voters will punish a government for stalemate, so they feed into the stalemate position. That's a little bit easier to do in Canberra, where the Senate it can be manipulated more to stop things than, say, what happens in New South Wales. But I think there's also a responsibility for oppositions to actually say if they really do believe in good policy reform and economic reform and creating opportunities, are they prepared to be part of that discussion from opposition, not just we'll do that reform but only when we're in government?
Quick, is Hanson going to run a candidate against you in Penrith, do you expect?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
Gentleman out the back.
My name's Max Wilcox. I come from the Penrith campus. I'm a student there, and I'd like to thank for what's been done for the West out there. We have a brilliant new library. We have good facilities, but there's something very worrying me at present, and that is some of our academics at the campus, I'm not sure how widespread it is, they're losing their rooms. They have to mark and talk with students in common areas. This is very worrying. We need our academics. They've worked hard to be where they are, with their studies, with their masters, with their PhDs, and with all the progress that we're given at the university as students. Are we not polishing the engine, but forgetting about the coal that goes in the boiler?
Thank you, sir. Andy, I don't often hear students taking up the case of their teachers, but you're first.
Yeah, look, the way that we learn in the university environment is changing absolutely at a breakneck speed, but there are some things that we have to hang on to for the interest of consistency, but also quality. The skills issue, as Stuart will be very well aware, and Michelle too, is writ large, particularly for Western Sydney. We've got a 30% gap in qualification levels of young people from here compared to Greater Sydney. So the way we teach at university, the environments we create, not only have to be the best academic environments, but they've got to be ones that reflect emerging work trends. They've got to be collaborative, they've got to be project-based, but they have to draw on that academic and scholarly tradition. So if we are changing the modality of some of that stuff, it's because of those other issues, those issues that are, I guess, writ large in our mind as to making sure our students are the best prepared they can be. You're going to face a world where you're going to have 6 to 7 career changes minimum as you enter the workforce now. There's no 30 years somewhere in a gold watch at the end of it anymore. But I'll have a look into that particular issue for you, and I can assure you that Professor Glover, the VC here, is responsive to any kind of feedback like that. And like government, we jump on that stuff pretty quickly. And we don't consider it a little issue, so I'll get back to you on that.
The summer's been dominated by the rise of the AFL Women's Code gone global. How do you pounce on that? How do you make the Giants are starting to win an awful lot of games, the men's team? How do we make sure that revolution doesn't only happen in AFL? It doesn't only happen, but it can spread it to a wider community. What did you learn from that so far that we could all apply somewhere else?
Well, the voices of influential people, whether they're in business, and we saw business jump on board with all the women's teams, all 8 of them. They had great sponsorship. It had good leadership from the AFLW. So Gil McLaughlin, the CEO, had the vision and the leadership, but it also takes a grassroots movement. You can call an elite competition for women, but if you haven't done the legwork and enabled pathways and community football clubs to exist and little girls to run out on the field and actually have a run, then they're never going to be able to perform at that level. And performance matters as much as the opportunity, because if you do not perform, people will be ruthless. At the end of the day, it's football, and like all things competitive, we want to see success, and success is measured more often than not by wins. So certainly business support, government support, good leadership, and the support for grassroots initiatives so that things organically grow from the bottom up.
Michelle, if AFL Women's gave them a great year backstop, our Parramatta Eels didn't do a whole lot for the reputation and corporate governance of a code I love. What did you learn as a Western Sydney leader after watching the dissembling nature of the once great Parramatta Eels back office?
Look, it was sad to watch, and of course it's been ongoing, unfortunately. But look, I think the Australian people, they actually like redemption. I think Australians are very happy
A lot of redemption needed at the Eels.
A lot is needed, but look, they start winning a couple more games, a couple more games would be good. I think they've got a very loyal base as well. And I think that has the capacity to continue growing. I think
Stuart's building us a new stadium. It'd be great.
So look,
That's not at Moore Park either.
Yeah. So I like to be an optimist about the Eels.
Okay.
This is going to be a great year.
Fantastic. There's a question down here.
Hi, my name's Maria Yelovich. I'm a student here at Western Sydney. We're talking about the health of Western Sydney and how much we really appreciate all our people here. What are our opinions on the incinerator, which isn't in Moore
There's the
Park?
big incinerator at Western Creek you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay. Who wants to kick off on the big incinerator?
Yeah, well, the idea of having an incinerator in Western Sydney is not something that I find very appealing. But one thing I would say is that we have a legal system here that determines how we accept developments. I think it's important that if you're going to have a trust and a faith in and encourage investment into our communities, that you've got to have some consistency in how that's applied. When it comes to that incinerator, it'll be determined by our Planning Assessment Commission, which is about removing the emotion and the politics and assessing the science and whether that's a complying development. I think that's an important thing that we go through with all of our developments, and it has to stack up. If it doesn't stack up, it won't go ahead.
Stuart, just while I got you there too, you said before, obviously, your strident support for the airport, it's been constant. Why are we only going to build one runway at the beginning and not build two at the same time?
Oh, that's a very, very good question, Chris. Look, if I was the Commonwealth Government, the idea of undertaking 5 years of civil engineering works to create a site that's flat, has one runway on it, a terminal ready to go, and not put the concrete down for the second runway, just seems like an unusual decision for me. I also think that a second runway, if you took advantage of all of the civil engineering works, helps with making the airport a airport that works for industry, not just for the commercial airlines and the tourism operators. So much of this airport discussion has been about how many tourists and how many individual flights will go in and out of that airport. 9 million passengers in the first year is probably the figure. If you built that second runway, there would never be enough aircraft to utilise that second runway from a commercial airlines or tourism perspective, but it provides so much airside land for us to be able to chase aviation, advanced manufacturing, defence activities where we don't have access to that airside land. I see Kerry Mather sitting down the front. I'm sure that she would give her right arm to have another 8 kilometres of airside land at KSA and be able to utilise all of the industry that comes off the back of that. And so if the airport is genuinely about generating jobs, I would build the second runway at relatively low cost, considering you absorb most of that cost.
Quick one to Michelle, then on airport too. Michelle, if you're in office in 18 months or 2 years' time, you'll be confronted with, unless it's been solved, that the existing airport at Mascot, which still is going to service Western Sydney for the next 10 years at least, is running out of capacity. You're going to be able to convince Albo that 80 movements per hour is not appropriate for a tertiary-based city that it's front door to the world?
Oh, look, I think of all members of Parliament, I think Anthony Albanese is the one with the most skin in the game on this. So, yes, I think that as we were saying earlier, that's one on which a decision will need to be made. But can I just go to the incinerator issue? Yeah, I'm opposed to it. I know Blacktown Council's opposed to it, and I know they'll be making submissions to that effect when they get the opportunity. I've been to a couple of community forums on it, and I'm yet to meet a person in Western Sydney who supports it as well.
Chris, could I
Andy, and then we'll go to the floor.
Very quickly on the airport, I think, I got stuck into government a bit earlier on for not being definitive, and Stuart then came back with a clear answer on just
Being
about
definitive.
all of it. With the airport, I don't think business has done enough to get behind it, and I think there's a few pieces to this puzzle, and whether you want to start with something that actually has scale that can generate that level of catalytic impact, you need to have business, at the front of the row, asking for something bigger and badder. I think government can be accused, all we like of, dithering on this issue. There's a 40-year history to it. It's been coming, and then it hasn't been coming, and now it's back on again. I think business needs to really make the case and say, listen, if you do this, we'll get behind it. That's how you get the rationale and the evidence to go larger.
Down here and then to Patrick.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Nicole, and I'm also a student here at Western Sydney.
I love the students. All you people who aren't students are asking questions, by the way. Just take note. Thank you, Nicole.
I'm from the Blue Mountains, and we're like perennial transport cynics. But basically, the whole thing about Western Sydney and like the 3 cities, and you're going to be able to live and work within 15 minutes. I just think that, what time frame do we even think that's going to happen in when it takes me on a train 2.5 hours to 3 hours to get to most places that are like an hour drive? on trains? Like, how feasible is it to actually, do you think, for people to live and work in Western Sydney when you can't even get to one part of Western Sydney on a train without, like, taking...
Andrew, you guys have done a fair bit of review. You've caught trains and you've run and jogged next to them and all sorts of things too. Is it getting any better? Is it a con, or can people feel comfortable it's on the way?
Yeah, it's going to be better than it was, but it's not going to be perfect, you know. And the metros help, but I think there's some conjecture as to the South West Metro they're building, whether that is going in the right place when it's just on where an existing line is. Then they're talking about West Metro, so that will help. That would be, you know, more rapid transit like a tube. That's what this city needs. The government's committing to it. I would hope if Labor were to be elected, they'd stick with these projects because the money's sort of there. But no, it's going to take a long time for the transport system that you want and need, unfortunately, because the area's been neglected for so long, for decades. You know, I mean, I remember as a young kid getting the private bus to Bankstown station took forever. To try and go to the city, it just took absolutely forever. So I can sort of, that was a very vague memory for me, but I can sympathise. If you haven't got a car in this part of the world, you're stuffed. So it was always the impression, unless you are lucky enough to live near the station. So, and that's where it goes back to Michelle's point about commuter car parks. But, you know, the hope and the vision of the government appears to be to build up public transport. It's not just a roads vision. They're doing the WestConnex as well, and that's very important. It's very important for a world city. We don't want to be LA, you know?
Yep. Lauren, well, you've got the microphone, and then to Patrick after that. A microphone over there, if you would mind, after that.
Okay. Hi, my name is Pauline Tan. I'm also a student at this university. And my question is just that throughout the whole day today that you've been talking a lot about potential for Western Sydney to grow through infrastructure, transport and so on. But my question is, do you think there's actually a capability for Western Sydney to grow that much? Like, do you think we have, like, Western Sydney has the manpower to, like, build all this infrastructure? Do you think everyone, there's like a lot of, there'll be like a lot of people to actually do the jobs that you're saying, and like
This question's
we
about...
have the education, and
Yep.
the Western Sydney people have the education to actually fulfill what you are saying, or are we just going to get people from the eastern suburbs to like fill those jobs as well?
Gee, I hope not. Thank you. Andy, why don't you, Andy and Stuart,
Look, it's a really good question, and that's the one figure that plays on my mind every day. There is a 30% lag in qualification levels between Greater Sydney and Western Sydney people entering the workforce. 30%. And that's things getting better. It was worse than that 5 years ago. The Greater Sydney Commission and other bodies have been terrific in identifying the need for precincts and knowledge-based employment generation. Great. They're all the right things, but none of this works. None of it works unless you close that gap, and then you do even better than that. You've got to pick winners as well. You've got to pick industries and cities. I'm afraid I'm not one that says there's a string of pearls. I love Jeff Roberts, he's a great bloke, but I don't think you can have an equal spread of the benefits or a like for like across, Liverpool, Campbelltown, Penrith and Blacktown. Each of them bring distinct strengths, and until we start teasing out those distinct differences, until we work out how to do that, we won't be able to market the place internationally, we won't be able to address that gap, and we won't attract investment, because each one's different and they've got to be sold as such.
Quick go, Stuart, and we'll go to Patrick.
Yeah, just really quickly, the question about growth, and particularly when it comes to population and jobs, for me, the population growth is going to continue to grow. That is not going to stop. It might fluctuate a little bit based on what the Commonwealth government does with migration intakes, but children are going to be born and the population is going to continue to grow. So the obligation exists with government on how you plan for that. And that planning is not just about lines on maps and colours in squares for where houses go and commerciality goes and roads and rail lines go. It also means we've got to be thinking about how each of those communities evolve. And this, I think, is is almost coming back to what I was saying about that macro and hyper-local thing that's driving the vote. We've got to be able to do that macro planning, but we've also got to be thinking about how communities will evolve at a quite local level, and that means having the diversity of services available, whether it be access to tertiary education, university or trade-based skills, having good access to local primary schools into high schools, having access to green space, and if you plan for that, then the growth comes. One of the things that I love about Western Sydney is it's not anti-growth the same way some more established suburbs are. There's an acceptance of growth in Western Sydney, but it comes with a deal. And the deal is that you keep delivering on the infrastructure and the quality of life to allow for that growth to be absorbed.
I've got a related question to that from Patrick.
Okay, thank you. Yes, my name's Patrick Darley-Jones. I live in Luddenham. I'll emphasise the word Luddenham. And this is I'm starting off with a gripe. Every time I hear someone quoting Badgerys Creek Airport, I cringe. There's no such place as Badgerys Creek Airport. It is Western Sydney Airport. Western Sydney Airport is being built, half of it in Badgerys Creek, half of it in Luddenham. So, anyway, on to my...
I think as Tony Jones says, we'll take that as a comment, yes?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. On to my question. My front door will be about 1.7 kilometres from the northern side of the first runway. So I live there. As I hear people talking about this airport, and I leave Stuart out of this one, I think, the vast majority, I think they have no idea where this airport is, what the topography is, what the place looks like, and what's going on. I really don't. And the reason I'm saying that, today I've heard many conversations about infrastructure. So roads, rail, schools, health, all of those things. You may not know this, and I guess this will be probably...
I'll bring the question forward, Patrick, sorry.
Around the whole region of the Western Sydney Airport, there is no sewage system. Everybody is on septic.
Sewage,
okay? And that is going to be a barrier to getting industry in. I'm a hotel owner. You tell me I need my 5 acres for my hotel and my car park, but then I need another 5 acres for a sewage plant. I'll tell you where to go. So what is being done, right, to bring Sydney Water on board to actually provide sewage for the region so that the airport can take place and we can invite business in?
Thanks. Gough Whitlam brought the sewerage in the 70s to Western Sydney. If you're the part of the federal government in 2 years' time, we're going to wait that long. If you've got to live at that airport, if the Sydney airport doesn't take up its rights and it's on the government to do, are you going to restart the sewerage revolution?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, one of Gough Whitlam's greatest legacy for Western Sydney is he left it fully flushed. So, I think that, that is, your point is well made. Your point is absolutely well made. And you also make a good point when we're talking about infrastructure in terms of roads and transport and so forth. Of course, the other big bit of infrastructure we haven't really discussed on this panel is technology. Connectivity of Western Sydney. We have a second-rate national broadband network that's being rolled out, which is a copper-based network. And I don't just say that to be partisan, I say that because it's a fact. It costs more and it does less. We've been talking for how many years about the benefits that come from telecommuting and being able to put an end to the hour-and-a-half long commute that so many of our constituents make each way, including my husband, each day, just as an example. But the fact is that too many residents and small businesses in Western Sydney are being penalised because what we could have had was a real first-class national broadband network.
You've linked the two beautifully, because we've also got to build the science park at Luddenham near the airport, and sewerage, the ultimate high-tech facility for Western Sydney that it's going to be.
And Chris, without that infrastructure, you can forget it. You need connectivity for everything from smart cars to having the large numbers of small businesses who are sole traders trying to operate from home, alleviating the amount of traffic on our roads and congestion. There's so many, I see, went west here today even, there's so many apps that exist now and so many different facilities that rely on, they exist now, they're off the shelf, but they rely on connectivity to be able to make them work. We've got some of the worst health, we haven't really gone to health yet. We are the diabetes capital of Australia. And what are we doing about it?
We gave them an award for trying to solve it. So
well, if we can solve it, that'd be good.
For starting the attempt.
I wonder if Walter can add.
Sorry, just to
Stuart,
quickly
my last
answer.
question
Yeah,
before
Patrick, really simply, I would describe to you as your challenge is an economy of scale challenge. One of the reasons why you don't have the same sewerage and water-based system in a place like Luddenham is because overwhelmingly people in Luddenham live on 5, 10 and 20 acre blocks. If you lived in a suburb on 500 square metres, the economy of scale available to the taxpayer to put your sewage system into the ground is a hell of a lot more affordable.
But that'll change, though, Stuart.
Indeed,
We're
but that's
going
the
to
point. That's the point, is that
done.
as growth comes, it's really good infrastructure and transport policy is good housing policy.
Last question off the floor, the gentleman in the front there.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you for the award. Walter Comet hit the Western Sydney Primary Health Network. We've heard a lot about investment in physical infrastructure, cars, trains, planes and automobiles, also hospitals. The reality is we cannot build enough hospitals to deal with the upstream problems that create the reason people go into hospitals. How can you assure us that there's going to be enough investment in prevention and primary care so we don't need to build more hospitals unnecessarily? And I think there needs to be more of a focus and certainly more investment in that, and certainly the Diabetes Initiative is well underfunded, frankly, to deal with some of those problems at the moment.
Yeah, I'll go first. Couldn't agree more.
Can I add to it, Stuart, first? We're all surprised the PN didn't get more than it did in the federal election, we're fair to say. Do you
We're
think
not talking
there's
about
more?
hospital beds, by the way. We're talking about how we fund prevention and primary care.
Correct. So I want to supplement the health infrastructure and the health service.
Look, it may have got ignored by both sides of politics federally, but it didn't get ignored by us after the federal election came and went. We made a $500 million announcement and have started the work on delivering that, and I think that's an important step in the right direction. But the point about not building enough hospitals is absolutely correct. I think on current growth rates at about 8 or 9%, the health budget in New South Wales, which is already around 30% of the state budget, will consume the entire budget sometime in the next 50 years. So that means that you won't have any of your taxpayer funds in New South Wales going towards transport, where you currently get about 75% of fare box revenue subsidised. You won't have any money for roads. You won't have any money for regional development. You won't have any money for emergency or police services. So the growth rates of health expenditure is the single biggest funding challenge that exists anywhere in the country, not just in New South Wales, anywhere in the country. And so until you get to a point where you're able to change the way in which we deliver healthcare services, to slow the rate of that growth down, you have a massive problem. The second thing you need to do is actually look outside of the health care environment to think about how you engineer out some of those long-term challenges. So this comes back to the way we plan cities, things like footpaths, open spaces. 50% of kids in the Netherlands ride their bike or walk to school. In Australia, it's now less than 10%.
Yeah, but it's flat.
And now, it's now less, well, pedal up the hill, Chris.
It probably helped too.
Walk up the hill. So what are the cultural changes that have happened in Australia over the last 15 or 20 years that have led to us changing behaviours like walking, cycling, being active people, less than what we were at some stage in the past? Because that's where we have to focus both policy settings and how we engineer solutions into the way we develop the built environment. If you don't do that, then that figure of 8%, it'll be 9% and 10% and 11% growth rates, and it'll just consume literally everything we're spending our money on.
It's a really good question, right? I'll be really quick, Chris. I would say this, but you've got to lift educational levels. We know every study on earth tells us that higher levels of literacy and educational attainment equate to better health outcomes, right? Number one. Think outside the traditional scope of healthcare. You guys are already doing it, but think digital. Think about remote care delivery and think about self-monitoring systems and ways to interact digitally. That's the soft infrastructure puzzle that we don't talk about nearly enough. We seem to be obsessed with roads and rail.
Well, we've got Dr. Google.
You got Dr. Google. I use it relentlessly. Lay awake at night thinking I've got everything. The other one is give your friendly old Western Sydney University more medical places. And I'll separate myself out of that one as well and say it makes sense on the evidence. The overwhelming majority of people that come to our School of Medicine and train to be doctors, they stay in the region. They stay and work in the region.
Magnificent new facility at Campbelltown as part of the hospital too. Let Michelle have a dig and then I'll give one last one to wind it up.
Well, a couple of years ago, it was quoted to me that for every notional dollar spent in health, it's less than 10 cents on preventative health. We can build all the hospitals that we like, but the fact is we don't want people to go into them. you actually want people to stay out of hospital. So my view is that the investment in primary healthcare for giving time for GPs to be able to diagnose you and to be able to make sure that you stay out of hospital, I think is probably the best start. And just in terms of, everyone's got the iPhone, you've got that little app there for health data, it actually works. And I think we should be moving to the next...
That's what scares me, it actually works.
We should be moving to the next... My view is we should be moving to the next level and be really discussing, we mentioned big data ingest a bit here, but it really is about who is controlling your health data as well. Like, we need to, I think, move towards a situation where people can take more control of their health, but they have the tools to do that, but also they have the guidance in the form of the primary, the frontline clinicians.
Can I just say...
And that way we'll become a much healthier
Very quick,
region.
just I promised all your stuff, I'll get you out on time.
Just really quickly, the uncomfortable part of the health discussion is not at the preventative stage, but it's about how we manage people at the end of their life. And there's a really strong focus by this government at the moment, I know federally, but it's a conversation that I think communities in Australia are a little bit reluctant to have, and that is about what we do in the palliative care space. A huge portion of funds that we invest into healthcare are really about managing the end of a person's life. And whilst we need to be able to respect what people and their families want through that phase, we have to be able to have a mature discussion about what is the best way to do that so that we can move, as Michelle just pointed out, that notional 10 cents in preventative care. One of the ways you'll be able to do that most effectively is to drive a better investment, and we are talking about dollars here, but a better investment in the way we manage people at the end of their life so they're not drawing down those resources, and those resources can be invested in preventative health.
So there's plenty of issues we didn't get to today, including euthanasia, but for our next subject, we only have some minor issues like radicalisation of Western Sydney youth, like criminality and drug abuse and housing affordability, just some issues that don't really matter much. But in amongst all of those sexy issues, one last thing I want to drop in the panel before we leave is some galoot went out today and said we ought to bid for the Commonwealth Games for the region. The same galoot went and told the Victorians that they shouldn't do it in regional Victoria because sheep shearing and fruit picking weren't yet Commonwealth Games sports. I'll never get invited back to my relatives in Wangaratta ever again. Andrew, you kick off. We did half in jest, half seriously. Do you think the city should be chasing Western Sydney chasing Com Games, and what's our chances of getting it?
Oh, why not? Pretty good, I reckon. The Com Games are a bit, it's a
bit naff.
Perth can get the Com Games, or Brisbane can, so why not? It's kind of, you don't have to, it's easier than an Olympics, I think is what I'm trying to say. So, and if you can't, Western Sydney's twice the size of Perth or Brisbane. So, not a bad idea. And if not the Com Games, other events like that. Yep. That's the key, I think.
Michelle, if you're in office in 2 years, you're going to put your hand up to help pay for, get it to Blacktown?
Look, I think Blacktown, as you know, we had some of the Olympic facilities there, but I don't know
Baseball's
how many of
not yet a
those are
school.
going
We'll
to
find something else to do there.
We'll find something else to do, but we started off as the training ground for the GWS Giants, so imagine what we can do during a Commonwealth Games.
Amna, it's not yet a Commonwealth sport AFL, but you could work hard, or you could switch to rugby. Cameron will sign you up for the rugby sevens team.
Oh, I don't know if rugby's my game, but certainly I know enough talent that I can hand them over to you.
Stuart, you could probably, if you're still, you're going to run the bid. Com Games. Penrith Lakes will do its bit if you're out there. You might even get that other stadium you've been touting for Penrith by then, once you've opened these other ones. You're the Minister for Sport, Minister for Western Sydney. It's seriously going to fall to you. Where do we finished today better than we started on it?
I think it's worthy of consideration. I think it's one that does require a little bit of work. I will say that one of the phrases I did read, attributed to you in the press today, that I didn't agree with was the low-cost phrase.
I thought it said low work cost.
In an environment where you're always looking from a competitive dollar perspective, a Commonwealth Games isn't low cost. That doesn't mean that it's not low value, or that it's low value, and it is worthy of consideration. We've got good infrastructure on the ground. It will need to be updated, but 2026 and 2030 are probably the right timeframes. I'm not interested in 2022. It's just too close.
Andy, Griffith Uni in in Gold Coast have been part of the Athletes Village. Personally, I think the greatest potential we have at the Com Games is building a new Athletes Village, particularly if we went into renewal at a Mount Druitt, at Green Valley and Ayres, or even to kick off Camellia. Universities are playing part of the role, student accommodation, low-cost housing beyond that.
Oh, absolutely. You know, and we again, this feeds into the health question as well. So look, it's something we would 100% support. I mean, I have trouble with the word Commonwealth. I have trouble saying it. But look, absolutely, we'd be behind it. And, you know, I can tell you what, I'd love to see Western Sydney form its own nation state, so we could take on the rest of the world and beat them.
I've got
a problem with the word Commonwealth.
I've got a 10-month-old baby girl, so if I get my 10-month-old baby girl going, she might wear the green and gold for the Western Sydney Commonwealth Games.
And being a Republican doesn't mean that you don't support the Commonwealth Games.
It makes the Commonwealth valid. Can I, before Rowan comes to thank the panellists and throw us all out of the room, my thanks to these guys who all hopped up here, prepared to get in the fight, take off the stripes, have the piss taken and take questions. That's always appreciated, and we chose people who aren't short of opinion and weren't afraid to wear it, and I really appreciate that. And to those who had the courage to put their hand up, I really appreciate it. But lastly, I wanted to pay a personal tribute to my team who put today on, to Brett Towers and Kim Shea and the team behind them with the dialogue who've worked really hard to drive this, and all the supporters, sponsors and partners. That's been fantastic. So thank you very much.